Hi Andy, this is a very rough version of stress, trauma and mental health as a podcast. The sound levels are probably all over the place, the delivery is probably all over the place. I'm just producing this for you just so that we can kind of work out if we're on the same song sheet in relation to tone and content, really. So please have a listen. If it's something that you're kind of happy with, I can produce it under more kind of studio conditions, if you like, and get all the delivery correctly. And then we can start sorting out graphics and have a chat about whether or not you want to get some kind of one of your senior officers to do a little intro at the very beginning in a kind of like enjoy the show kind of thing. But yeah, have a listen and we can have a discussion afterwards, depending on what you think. So where are we? Okay, so yeah, stress, trauma and mental health. Hello, it's Darren Moor again, retired police sergeant and writer on police health. And welcome to another in our podcasts, produced in collaboration with South Wales Police, where we offer advice to the partners and families of police officers, and especially new police officers. In this podcast, we're going to talk about stress, trauma and mental health in policing, and make some suggestions about how you can help that officer of yours through difficult times. Wow, that all sounds a little bit grim, doesn't it? But we're going to start on a positive note because, amazingly, policing isn't all bad from a mental health perspective. There are some real benefits for your partner or loved one through being in the job. So, what are those benefits? Well, for a start, they often work in small teams that tend to bond closely together. That's good. And from this, they can develop a real network of close friends through the service that crosses over into their private life. I've still got mates who I first worked with 30 years ago. They're also working for a common purpose. That's something else that's good from a mental health perspective. And they're basically doing something that's good for society. It's something to be proud of. The job is often interesting. Police officers always have the best stories at parties and sometimes can be really exciting. There's also different roles you can get involved in, swapping between different jobs throughout your career. And as you may have noticed, policing can also be very funny. There's a lot of laughter on police teams. They're not all miserable like you see them on those police dramas on TV. And frequently within the job, you get to do things which make a real difference to people's lives. Maybe helping them out during that once-in-a-lifetime crisis. And that gives you a boost on a regular basis. Oh, and you're also part of a big organisation, something substantial, which tends to make us feel good about ourselves. And wherever you go in the country, or even another country, and speak to an officer, you'll know that you have a bond with them, even if you've never met them before. And here's something else on a positive note. The mental health of police officers is taken extremely seriously these days. Unlike in the past where, although there was help available, take it from me, as someone who started in 1990, it was all, well, a bit clunky, I suppose. Assistance for officers today is a lot more streamlined, both at a local level and as an organisation generally. South Wales Police, for example, use a system called TRIM to help officers and staff at local level following traumatic events. They will be routinely spoken to after such an incident just to check that they're okay, and if necessary, further help can be arranged. So, yeah, in the bad old days, officers would have been expected to just get on with it. Things weren't good. But now there's a genuine commitment in policing to get it right. So much so that I think you would struggle to find any profession where mental health amongst the workforce is taken more seriously. However, despite all this good, positive stuff I've just yabbered on about, we do, when you think about it, tend to focus on the negatives, don't we? Not through being depressed or anything like that, but because, well, that's what we naturally do as humans. And this concept is worth understanding about mental health from the outset, whether you're a police officer or not. And the reason we are a little glass half empty, if you like, even if we do like to think that we're all positive and chirpy, is that we as a species are hotwired for survival to focus on the negatives in any given situation. It's a primeval thing. If you remember in the Sleep podcast, I described how humans have been on the planet for around 2.5 million years. But it's only during the last 10,000 years that we've developed from hunter-gatherers living in caves to the developed and complex human beings that we are today. In respect to sleep, that meant, because we used to sleep in caves, that we associated sleeping with it being cold and dark, which is why shift workers, like your loved ones, find it harder to sleep during the day after nights when it's warm and bright. But that primeval mindset, hotwired over those millions of years, also affects our attitudes to life and dangers. Just think about it for a moment. Imagine in ancient times that you emerged from your cave into the early morning light and cast an eye over the landscape. What do you think is going to interest you, do you reckon? Is it going to be that gorgeous sunrise coming over the mountains? Is it going to be fluffy clouds that look pretty? Ah, look, there's a butterfly. No. What you were looking for was danger. The small but deadly snake that could bite you. The poisonous spider. Fresh footprints from that saber-toothed tiger that was hanging around a few days ago. In essence, you weren't bothered about the good stuff when reviewing your landscape because you were too busy sweeping it for things that were going to kill you within the next couple of minutes. And that's how we survived. And this prehistoric mindset, hot-wired and embedded over millions of years, remains stubbornly with us today. We're subconsciously programmed to look for things that are going to harm us, even when they're not there. And this can, if we're not careful, encourage a mindset of focusing on the negatives within a situation, disregarding all that's good, and just homing in on what's bad, or certainly what we perceive as bad. You see it all the time. We arrive in some fabulous resort for the first day of our really expensive holiday, and you know what? It's wonderful. Everything's perfect. But we, of course, find ourselves focusing on that one thing that isn't perfect. The stupidest little thing that we allow ourselves to get wound up about. Or you get the bride and groom on their wedding day who allow some minor little hiccup, the silliest little thing, to ruin their perfect day. This facet of our character tends to rear its ugly little head, especially when we're experiencing something new, or meeting someone new, or are just a little bit kind of stressed up anyway. And all that's happening here is that the ancient, prehistoric part of our brain is looking for danger, and, in the absence of some saber-toothed tiger, has become a little over-obsessed with, well, just about anything that could be concerning. We're hot-wired, in a Darwin kind of way I suppose, to be constantly scanning our landscape for danger, because that's how we survived for all those millions of years when there was actually something to be worried about. So, we need to be aware of this mindset now, and we need to factor it in when doing something new, or meeting someone we've never met before, or think that we might be a little bit stressed up generally as a result of this or that or the other. We have to constantly remind ourselves not to fixate on the negatives in any given situation, because they're probably not as bad as they seem. So, whether you're a police officer or not, that's a good general facet of mental health that we need to be aware of. And now we got that squared away, let's concentrate more on the issues facing police officers, that loved one of yours. And we're going to start by discussing a concept that you're probably aware of already: freeze, fight, flight. But we're going to look at it again anyway, because so many officers, and especially new officers, worry when they do freeze, fight or flight in reaction to trauma and confrontation, when really they shouldn't be concerned, because these reactions are entirely normal. The simple fact is that we all freeze in the face of confrontation and traumatic seize, because, again, we're hotwired to do it. During those millions of years when we were hunter-gathering, if we come across some animal that might want to eat us, then our brain's go-to reaction was to stand very still and keep very quiet. This was logical, as movement attracts attention, and which is something that you see in nature programs all the time. And this factory setting remains stubbornly with us today. When we perceive danger, especially sudden danger, then the prehistoric part of our brain elbows its way to the front of the decision-making process like some overprotective parent and has us freeze while assessing just what's going on here. An example? Well, you absent-mindedly walk out into the road and suddenly see a car zooming down upon you. Your instant reaction is to freeze, and that reaction, thank you very much, prehistoric brain, has just saved your life. However, the problem is, of course, that society wants its police officers to deal with situations, not freeze in the face of them. And many inexperienced officers who do freeze when threatened with violence or arriving at some traumatic incident full of grief and mayhem feel embarrassed with their wide-eyed response. But they shouldn't be, because freezing in the face of danger is a natural automatic reaction and one which they will learn to overcome in time, in the same way that their more experienced colleagues have learnt to already. And anyway, although they may have thought that they had frozen for some ghastly never-ending period, it was probably only a split second anyway. And it does happen even to the more experienced officers. I remember maybe 25 years into my service, turning up to a fatal road accident, opening up the car door, and then freezing at the sight of the mangled bodies. Was I embarrassed by my actions? No, not in the slightest. The reaction was totally normal when you take into account what I was looking at. Having first froze us in the face of danger, our prehistoric brain will then automatically prepare us for the contrasting options of fight, as in defending ourselves against the danger, or flight, well, running away as quickly as our little legs will carry us. But unfortunately, this too can cause embarrassment for the inexperienced officer, as it triggers various physical reactions around the body, some of which would be absolutely marvellous if we truly were encountering some life or death situation, but tend to be pretty unhelpful if the only danger we're facing is a bit of verbal from some drunk outside a nightclub. And that's the problem. Our prehistoric brain isn't very good at assessing or grading just how dangerous the situation is. It tends to trigger the same physical responses whether we're facing that saber-toothed tiger, it's always a saber-toothed tiger, isn't it, in these scenarios, or just a mouthy drunk, in that we tense up, especially in the shoulders and neck, our face flushes, and our heart rate goes into overdrive. We might notice that our breathing becomes faster and shallower, while our mouth dries, perhaps resulting in our voice sounding odd, or, horror of horrors for the police officer in front of that unsympathetic crowd, squeaky. While a sudden release of adrenaline around the body might mean that our hands tremble. The poor old officer notices these changes and becomes embarrassed that others might pick up on them too, because, of course, they're a police officer and they're supposed to be calm and collected at moments like this, not flushed, trembling and squeaky voiced. So, here's the point. When they come home from work, looking a bit sheepish, and describe some reactions at an incident along these lines, you can tell them, from me, that it's nothing to worry about. These are reactions that they've got no control over and tend to happen to all new officers, and even older officers who find themselves back in frontline roles after some years away. And For the most part, it'll get better in the long term. Yeah, and I say for the most part because although the more exposed your loved one is to stuff like this, the calmer, if you like, they react, this mindset also has a habit of triggering these physical symptoms at times when, and this is another one that's relevant, whether you're in the police or not, we're not facing any danger at all, apart from having to deal with something grim that we'd rather not. We get a dodgy letter or email that needs sorting out, doing our driving test, having to give a speech. You know what? Our life is full of little dramas, isn't it? And here's the thing. Wonderful though our prehistoric brain is, it has, I repeat, little concept of nuance. It will happily trigger the same physical reactions these days for a distressing email than it would have millions of years ago for something life-threatening, just in case you need to do a bit of fight or flighting. And so, it's down to us, when we sense these reactions, to remind ourselves that the only danger that we're in is one to our ego, or being lumbered with some irritating work, not death. And, as it seems that death is off the table now, a more sensible response might be to take a moment to deep breathe, thank our prehistoric brain for its interest, but advise it that we don't expect to be eaten today. Reflect on the issues at hand and try and make sense of them. Come up with a practical solution and, well, get on with it, I suppose. Doesn't that sound like a much better idea? That sounds like a much better idea, doesn't it? Now let's talk about police officer reactions after trauma. Why is it that some officers are more affected by an incident than others? Obviously, a lot of this comes down to experience. But why then do some incidents affect officers badly, even when they are experienced? I was a trim practitioner for 14 years. Trim is that system I described earlier, used by South Wales Police, where officers and staff support other officers and staff following something rotten. The idea being that if you're upset by an incident, you're more likely to open up to someone you perceive as being like yourself than maybe some counsellor. And I learned from that experience that there tends to be 4 categories of people who could be particularly affected by an incident. The first, unsurprisingly, is people new to the job. Maybe your loved one if they've just joined, and they're experiencing some horror for the first time. That rite of passage thing. And what could be more understandable than that? They're seeing sights that nobody wants to see, but unfortunately are all part of the police officer role. The reality is that during these first couple of months and years, they will come home at times distracted, upset, or perhaps even moody about what they've experienced at work. As time goes by, as is the nature of things, most officers become less affected by horrible sights. We simply adjust to it, I guess, and amazingly, after a while, you become more concerned in getting the admin right at an incident than the ghastly sights in front of you. Which all sounds rather callous, I suspect, but at least is a way of coping with these things. Some advice though, and especially for the partners of police officers. Have an arrangement with them that they will always give you a heads up if they experience something rotten at work. The thing is, I never used to, and it wasn't good. Allow me to explain more. By the time I met my wife, I'd been an officer for maybe 6 years, and the novelty of talking about tragic events had left me. I didn't like telling her stuff because it all sounded a bit ghoulish, and there was also an element of not wishing to put unpleasant images in her mind. Instead, I tended to just be a bit off and moody, I suppose, distracted, not my chirpy self, and probably not fun to live with. But then I was given some really good advice. Surely it's natural to be upset, or at least unsettled, by these events. They may influence our temper, level of concentration, or quality of sleep. We're bound to come across as a bit funny, aren't we? But if we open up by telling our partner that something's happened, not every gruesome detail, but just enough to make them aware of what we're going through, then at least they won't have to spend the next couple of days thinking that there's something wrong between the pair of you as a couple. Why are they fed up with me? What have I done wrong? It's so important to have that conversation with your partner. If something happens at work, then please let me know. Not all the gory stuff, but just so that I'm just enough so that I'm not thinking that it's me that you're fed up with. Love you. And so, to conclude, the first category of officer likely to be affected by this stuff is those seeing things for the first time. The second, and this is one where it doesn't matter if you're experienced, inexperienced or whatever, is caused by something known in trauma circles as dislocated expectation. That's where an officer is sent to a routine incident, something nice and simple, stress-free, which then turns out to be a whole lot worse, and generally, I'm afraid, involves the unexpected discovery of a mangled body, something like that. A classic example of this? Well, one night some officers from my team were sent to an elderly missing person from a nursing home. The old lady had gone walkabout. They started searching the garden with their torches, all very relaxed, probably having a nice chat, and were as happy as can be right up to the moment that they found the old dear, with her head stoved in. What she'd done was walked out through a fire escape on the second floor onto a flat roof, and then fallen headfirst into the garden beneath. So, there you go. Classic dislocated expectation. They get sent to an easy, non-traumatic call, which then turns into a really horrible, traumatic one out of nowhere. Now, if those same officers had known en route to the call that they were going to something ghastly with horrible sights to see, their subconscious would have mentally prepared them for it. But they weren't prepared and so suffered more trauma as a result of that dislocated expectation. And often, I found, if this dislocated expectation was mixed with a sense of someone's at fault, perhaps a nursing home in this case for not keeping an eye on their patients, then that reaction is even more intense. It grates on them even more. The third category of officer who gets affected by an incident is unusual in that, under normal circumstances, they wouldn't have reacted badly to the event at all. It's just that at that particular time, they're also having to put up with a lot in their private life. One of the kids is ill. Your house move has fallen through. Anything like that, really. Basically, it's all going a bit wrong at home, and they've run down their tank, if you like, of emotional resources to deal with all that stress. And then, of course, the job shoves on top of that some horrendous suicide or something, and it all falls apart for them. And it doesn't even need to be bad things on the home front. I had one guy who was simply getting married the following week. He just had too much on his plate to deal with at that precise time, and so had a bit of a meltdown following what was a pretty routine sudden death. And who can blame him? So, being as you are the home front, as it were, that might be something for you to consider if they're strangely affected by an incident. Is this reaction more as a result of what's going on at home than work? And if it is there anything practical that we can do about it? The fourth group, inevitably, tends to be those suffering from just a build-up of horrible events. Their bucket of stress in respect to this kind of stuff is overflowing, if you like. This might be short-term, but is often, especially with those long in service, as a result of some particular unresolved incidents from years ago, especially if they're a similar nature to that one today. In particular, I found detective sergeants and detective inspectors more susceptible to long-term issues, resulting in them actively seeking help for problems, which is unsurprising, as they might find themselves going to all the rotten sudden deaths, as well as dealing with the endless inquiries afterwards. And that can be a fundamental difference in police trauma terms between uniform and detective roles. A patrol officer might deal with a particularly nasty sudden death maybe once every 6 months or so, but at least tends to hand them over. An average DS goes out to these things maybe once every couple of weeks and then keeps hold of the inquiry. I've dealt with DSs who have been managing a dozen or so long-term death inquiries and just keep picking up more. A reason I tried hard to recruit CID officers as trim practitioners, while trying to overcome that perception that trim was more a uniform thing. So, there you are, 4 groups of police officers that seem to suffer particular issues after trauma. But there are also some general factors associated with trauma as well. Personalisation is a recognised trigger. If the officer, for example, has a 4-year-old daughter and then goes to the death of a 4-year-old girl, then that's bound to upset them more, isn't it? Because it has them imagining the death of their own child. Significant post-trauma is another one. Perhaps they were in the military and saw death and injury in some overseas conflict. Then that could make them more susceptible to being affected by trauma in later years, as could suffering trauma when they were a child. Now, moving on, what advice can I offer you about how you can help them when they do come home affected by some horrible event? Well, fortunately, a lot of the groundwork is done already because you're listening to this podcast. Well done you. From taking the time to listen to the podcast, you've already understand many of the reasons for traumatic reactions, so that's a great start. And just as importantly, I've no doubt you're going to have that chat with them, where they're going to agree to give you a heads up if they experience something rotten at work, which is brilliant in itself, in that it avoids one of those stupid flare-ups where you might mention some annoyance during your day, and they instantly, and maybe angrily, compare it with the, train suicide that they spent most of their day dealing with. Quite literally picking up the pieces, but decided not to mention because it might upset you. Something else you can do to help is show some understanding about them being distracted and absent-minded, as that's a common theme after trauma. They might not take in what you say, for example. And they're also prone to silly accidents. So this isn't a good time to let them go up a ladder or fillet a bit of fish with the world's sharpest knife. And talking of food, don't be surprised also if it affects their digestion. This again is normal. Where possible, news reports of the incident are generally best avoided. When you're upset by something, having been there, no media coverage of the event tends to cheer you up and often makes you feel a whole lot worse, even angry. And surprisingly and unsurprisingly, traumatic incidents and stress from work in general can also affect their sleep. In fact, that's one of the most common experiences for police officers. Lying in bed but unable to sleep because there's too much stuff, noise going on in their head and they just can't switch off from it. It could be that traumatic incident, but it might just be workload, all those crime reports and case files. Or maybe they're going to court tomorrow and know that they have a tough day in progress. And know that they have a tough day in prospect. Problems without solutions are just buzzing around their head. It's a horrible feeling. So let's now move away from trauma for a moment and talk about things that you could suggest if they can't sleep, whether that's as a result of that trauma or any of the other stresses of policing. Both the solutions I'm going to offer here now have been great for me in the past, and they work through giving that stressed up brain of theirs something to think about other than the problems that seem so overwhelming. And apologies, but the first solution may seem a little wacky, so you're going to have to trust me, because it's nothing more than singing. And I mean singing to yourself, mentally, not out aloud. If you suggest that to them, that might scare the life out of you in the middle of the night when they start doing it. As soon as they realise that they can't sleep, then what they need to do is to start running through the lines of a song with some gentle tune for which they know all the words, which kind of suggests that it's a song that they like, doesn't it? Singing, mentally in this case, not only lowers our blood pressure, but more importantly, it gives our frazzled brain something practical to think about, as opposed to all those stupid problems. And yeah, no doubt, after a few minutes, those stupid problems will want to burst back in on us again. But don't let it. Force out the worries and just concentrate on your singing. And when you get to the end of the song, just start that song again, or sing a different song. Have a whole playlist of non-sleeping songs if you like. It sounds bizarre, but trust me, it works really, really well. A second method I've used is simply counting backwards from 1,000, but here's the important bit: you make it even harder for your brain by carefully visualising each number as you get there. For example, try visualising now, say 978. Can you? It actually takes quite a lot of concentration to do that, doesn't it? And that's a lot of brain power that you're switching away from those problems that were bugging you. So yeah, count down backwards and keep visualising those numbers. Again, any problem will want to force their way back in after a while, but turf them out again and just concentrate on your counting. Now, the gold standard method of relaxing under these circumstances, the method that some sleep specialists might teach you, is deep breathing, but done in a particular way. It's all about inhaling through the nose, inflating the tummy as opposed to the chest, and then breathing out through your mouth. But I'm not going to explain it in this podcast because, well, if you do it properly, it's such an effective technique in terms of relaxation that it will very quickly lower your blood pressure to such an extent that you might get lightheaded, which of course is great if you're trying to sleep, but might be a bit of an issue if you're driving your car while listening to this, or doing something else where you need to have your wits about you. Instead, can I suggest that you listen to the podcast that we have in this series devoted simply to deep breathing? In fact, why not listen to that podcast with your partner? Because in it, I explain how the technique is also one that they can use at work when things are getting a bit stressy. So yeah, listen to that podcast and I'll explain all. Before we finish with sleep, let's talk a little bit about nightmares. The reality is, of course, that policing is such a roller coaster that it weighs heavily on our subconscious. Let me tell you, for the first 6 months after I retired, I quite literally dreamed about policing scenarios every night. Not nightmares, but just constantly running through policing dilemmas, practical problems, team issues, all these things through my mind. It was like, having been dealing with this stuff day in, day out for decades, my brain then couldn't stop thinking about it. The only reason I mention this is that it demonstrates just how deep our subconscious is and how being a police officer can affect your loved one as they try to process information while asleep. And yeah, when I was at work, I used to regularly have what I refer to as work dreams, as opposed to nightmares, all involving police scenarios, but with a bit of danger involved. And I've known many police officers who have them as well. For me, they would happen perhaps once a month, and they developed into such a familiar format that I recognised them for what they were within a moment of waking up, and so were never bothered by them. And curiously, they all follow the same pattern. They would happen almost immediately after I dropped off to sleep. It was always dark in the dream, or would involve in some kind of confrontation with someone whose face I could never see because of that darkness. It was never the same person though. We would be nose to nose because of some naughtiness he was doing, and just as he was about to attack me, I would go to hit him first, but then wake up with a start before I did so. How often I got these dreams depended on what role I was doing at the time. Unsurprisingly, I got them more often when I was doing patrol work, and so I had more confrontations with people. I used to also wake up sometimes in the morning to discover a rather disgruntled wife moaning about being shoved or elbowed in the night, during what was clearly some more serious dream of which I only had the barest recollection. According to the NHS, nightmares in adults are often linked to trauma or stress, which of course is a familiar part of the police experience, and it's not unusual for the sufferer to have little memory of them the following morning. So what I guess I'm saying is, don't worry too much if your loved one describes the occasional confrontation work dream, like the one I've just described, because they're just par for the course. But if they're telling you that they're always having bad dreams, or you know that they're having bad dreams that they're not even aware of, then it may be a good idea for them to have a chat with their doctor or the Force Occupational Health Unit. They won't be the first officer to have issues like this. Anyway, that's enough about sleep and dreaming for the moment. Let's return again to the subject of how police officers react after trauma. Something else that's worth knowing is that officers sometimes have a distorted recollection of a traumatic event, and it's only in the days following it that they remember things as they really were. I mention this in case they sound confused over an incident or start questioning their own memory. That distorted recollection is not unusual. As I said earlier, South Wales Police is one of a number of forces who use a system called TRIM to help other officers and staff in the aftermath of upsetting events. This is great, as TRIM is a brilliant system. In fact, I would go as far as to say that its introduction to police was the biggest step forward in officer welfare during my 30-year career. The way it works is that soon after a traumatic event, every officer and member of staff involved will be contacted by a TRIM practitioner, who would also be an officer or a member of staff experienced in these kind of incidents. As practitioners are based locally on stations, they could well know the officer already. The practitioner will check how the person is, discuss possible reactions, consider welfare, and offer them the chance to take part in TRIM monitoring. That's where the person sits down with the practitioner at set times to discuss their reactions. The first few days after the event, the second a few weeks after, and the third session a few months afterwards. As I said earlier, the reason why practitioners are fellow officers and staff is that someone traumatised is often more likely to talk to someone they perceive as being like themselves, as opposed perhaps to some mental health professional, especially as they know that practitioner would have experienced these kind of events themselves during their service. And the reason why that first formal session doesn't occur for a few days is because after trauma, it actually takes us a bit of time to understand just how we feel about an event. And often, despite being really upset at the time, we recover incredibly quickly. If you remember earlier, I explained how we as humans are hotwired to be constantly scanning our landscape for danger. But on the upside, we're also very good at getting over stuff like emotional distress. As a practitioner, I always used to compare some traumatic event with me badly cutting my hand on a piece of glass. On the day it happens, it really hurts, there's blood everywhere, and I'm a right old mess. A couple of days later, though, my hand's beginning to recover, and I'm feeling better about life. A few weeks later, the stitches are out, and all the pain's gone. And a few months later after that, well, you can remember the incident, you might have a little scar, but you're not really bothered by it. The point is that we tend to recover from stuff, but TRIM's always there to make sure that we do. That's why the practitioner speaks with a person again after a couple of weeks and then again after a couple of months. And if that practitioner feels that the officer isn't recovering, then they will discuss with them the option of self-referring to occupational health for more specialised help. As I say, it's a great system. Having mentioned occupational health, let's talk a bit more about them now. The modern police service understands the pressures that this job places on its officers and staff. It's a tough job. It also understands the pressures that modern life places upon us. At times, we're all going to need a bit of help, and at times, we're all going to need a bit of help. But in the police service, that help is always available. Your loved one can self-refer themselves to occupational health whenever they need to. Assistance is only a phone call or an email away. Assistance is only a phone call or an email away. And they can also speak to their supervisor. In fact, they should speak to their supervisor because, as I say, policing is a tough job. And if someone needs some additional support, then supervisors will want to provide it, tailor-made to what's required. But of course, they can only provide that support if they know what's going on. So if your loved one isn't at their best because of problems on the home front, and it could be anything, maybe the kids are sick, the house move has fallen through, then suggest that they have a quiet word with their supervisor. Some practical solutions might be available. Some practical solutions might be available. There's a lot of in-house support if you know where to go. Or that supervisor could simply make some adjustments or allowances to their work life to get them over this tricky stage. The important thing is that they don't suffer in silence. That's no good for anybody. And nor should you, for that matter. And that's why I'm going to finish with a couple of suggestions aimed squarely at the partners of officers and staff. Because it's not easy being in a relationship with someone doing this most demanding of jobs. The first one is to challenge that most horrendous bugbear of partners, them reading work emails while off duty. What a classic way to disrespect you. I can understand why it's such a temptation for police officers and staff. Just checking in with work, but encourage them not to do it. Because from that moment they read that work email at home that really cheeses them off, then their mood changes and their rest day is ruined. Now, I appreciate that they don't want to be caught cold by something grim at work, but then they don't have to be, do they? Just suggest that they scan their emails in the hour or so before leaving home if they're that concerned. Because at that stage, they're in work mode anyway, with no family time left to screw up. And they still have time to reflect on what needs to be done while getting into work. Work social media is another one that you may wish to discourage them from becoming too fixated on while off duty. If they're part of the team WhatsApp group or whatever, then do you really want them to be wasting rest days responding to some work intrigue about who's getting the driving course or whatever when they're supposed to be doing the family bit with you? No, you don't. So yes, encourage them to respect the family by, wherever possible, leaving work at work. And here's a final tip before we finish, again aimed towards all you partners out there. Late turns are where it all tends to go wrong on the home front. Late turns are where it all tends to go wrong in the police relationship. You and your partner just lose track of each other. You become distant. So, make plans before those late turns start. Who's covering what responsibilities and when? Also, encourage them to get the sleep they need after those late finishes to stay well and keep your relationship good. Nothing destroys a relationship like one of you always being tired. And I appreciate that that's not always easy. And most importantly of all, talk a lot on the phone to keep that communication up. Have a routine arrangement where you'll call them when you're at work in the morning and they'll call you when they're working during the evening. Video calls are even better. And here's another great idea. And another great idea is to make plans for after lates. Something nice to look forward to. It needn't be elaborate, just something that you both enjoy doing together. Make those arrangements and keep talking. Because lates can be horrible. And that's your lot for today. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks for supporting your officer on the home front. It is so important. It's so important. You know what? I've no doubt I would never have survived my police career without the support of my wife and family over all those years. It's what makes all the difference. And thanks to South Wales Police for collaborating on this podcast. And well done for realising the importance of supporting families. And well done to them for realising the importance of supporting families. Tell your partner from me to stay safe and be lucky. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Well, Andy, I can see that this has taken 44 minutes, which means that the podcast probably runs to at least 43 minutes, which I think might be a big ask for people to listen to. So we might have to consider, and I'm willing to take some advice from you, as to whether or not we break that down into 2 separate podcasts. Like I say, this is only a rough kind of read through. It'll be more studio conditions, a better delivery when we do it, and we'll have to sort out some graphics and things like that. But have a listen and let's have a chat. Thanks very much.